that elaborates up into the motor system, and that enables you to act voluntarily in the world, and then that elaborates up into the prefrontal motor system, which helps you plan how you might act in the world. Right? So it's the prefrontal cortex that's the home of, let's call it complex, sophisticated, voluntary thought, which you could think about as a way of representing the world, but which is more accurately a way of generating avatars of yourself in hypothetical worlds to figure out how they would survive if you did implement them into action. And so I think that's why. So one of the weird things that you discover psychometrically is that there's no correlation between conscientiousness and intelligence. And that's a weird one, you know, because people think about intelligence as planning and forward thinking and all of that, but that's also how they think about conscientiousness, as planful behavior and the consideration of future possibilities. But intelligence and conscientiousness have zero correlation. And so you think, well, why is that? Well, I guess it has to be that way because you couldn't think abstractly if you were prone to act out what you thought. You just go and act it out. And that, like, I mentioned this to you before, when you dream, you're paralyzed. And you can take that little part of the brain that produces that paralysis out of a cat, or out of a person, but we haven't done it with people, out of a cat. And then when the cat falls asleep and hits REM sleep, it'll run around until it runs into something and then it'll wake up. Well, so the dream thinking is so tightly allied with action that there's no separation between them. So there's no real abstraction there. If you couldn't abstract, you wouldn't be able to think. And the fact that you can abstract means that you can separate your thinking from your action. So that's why, as far as I can tell, there's very little correlation between conscientiousness and intelligence. It's like it has to be that way. Because you have to be able to think about things that you wouldn't do if you're going to think. So, and generally we think of people who act as soon as they think as impulsive. So, okay, well, so there's a huge part of the brain that's devoted to sensory processing, and there's a huge part of the brain that's devoted to planning, and the whole prefrontal part of the brain is devoted to planning. And that's, and again, so what that indicates is that in large part, as far as your evolved body is concerned, the reason is that you think is so that you can act better. And of course that makes sense. And you can think about memory from that perspective too, because if you think scientifically, you think that your memory of the world is something like an objective record of events, but it's really not very much like that at all. And besides, who cares? You don't need an accurate representation of all the facts about this room. In fact, all it would do is weigh you down. Who cares what color the walls are, or what color the ceiling is, or what color the paint is? All of that's not worth remembering, partly because it has no relationship whatsoever to what you need to do in order to continue to act. And so what you're doing when you remember, as far as I can tell, is that you're mining your experience for information that you can bring forward into the future. It's purely pragmatic. And so, you know, I treat people who have post-traumatic disorder or symptoms of post-traumatic disorder. And so let's say they got post-traumatic stress disorder because, again, because a relationship collapsed on them suddenly, which is quite common. You know, they get betrayed or someone leaves them suddenly, and then they don't know what to do, because, especially if they're conscientious, because then they just tear themselves into pieces trying to figure out what they did wrong to bring about that event. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to retool their perceptions and their actions so that the probability that they'll have the same experience again is minimized. And their mind won't leave them alone till they do it. And no wonder, right? Because if you fall into a big pit and you get really hurt, the first thing you should figure out is how to not fall into big pits anymore. And your mind is set up exactly for that. And so what you do with someone who's having problems like that, so maybe they're waking up at the middle of the night obsessing about what went wrong, is you walk them through it. You do a situational analysis first, because one of the oversimplifications that people make, and this is especially true for conscientious people, is if something bad happened to me, I must have done something to deserve it. Now that's actually a pretty functional idea, because it suggests that there are things about your behavior that you could change that would make the future better. But the problem is that say if it's the collapse of a relationship and you've been with that person for 8 years or longer, well, you did so many things with them that the idea that you did something wrong pretty much extends to every single thing you ever did with them. And that's, how are you going to fix that? And so that's part of the trauma, actually. The trauma is 80 million snakes all at the same time. It's like, well, forget it. You don't have time to go through all that material. And so partly what you do is with people, and this is what you should do with yourself too, is you do a situational analysis. It's like, don't be assuming necessarily that the thing that happened to you only happened to you because of what you did or didn't do. There's all sorts of factors at play. So one of the things that sometimes I do with clients is if they were in a relationship and I can get some reasonable personality information about both of them, I can point out where they were temperamentally incompatible.